Good evening to all of you who are with us at the moment, and hopefully more will join as we go along with this Q&A this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to watch the film, which premiered at 5 o'clock UK time this evening, Warton's War on Yemen, the latest short film coming out of Declassified UK, who have done extraordinary work in the short time that Declassified has been around on the British arms trade, on British foreign policy, and its impacts on the world. My name is Andrew Feinstein. I am a board member of Declassified UK. I am also the author of The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade and executive director of Shadow World Investigations based in London. We have an extraordinary panel to answer your questions tonight. Two of them you would have noticed in the film. You certainly could not have watched the film and missed Matt Kennard, who was rushing around in Warton and Preston and harassing people left, right, and center, most of whom didn't want to speak to him. Matt is the chief investigator at Declassified UK and has a long and storied career in journalism, as I mentioned, having done a huge amount of work initially in Latin America. He is the author of 2 books and has investigated and written many of Declassified stories on the role of the British state, both in the United Kingdom and abroad. You might have also spotted Phil Miller from Declassified. Phil is the chief reporter at Declassified UK. Not so long ago, he published a superb book on the mercenary operation Keeny Meeny Services that was accompanied by a film about the company's role in Sri Lanka. Phil has been with Declassified. I can't remember exactly the length of time. He might tell us when he comes to answer the first question. Before that was at the Morning Star and has for a while now been regarded by many people, including myself, as undoubtedly one of the leading young investigative reporters in the United Kingdom. So with Matt and Phil, we have 2 of the 3-person team that really drives Declassified, the third being Mark Curtis, the editor, whose work I'm sure is known to many of you. From outside of Declassified, we're delighted to welcome Kirsten Bayes from Campaign Against Arms Trade, CAT, as it's known to many of us. Kirsten is the local outreach coordinator at CAT, and I think it's fair to say that in my over 20 years of working on the global arms trade, I'm not sure that I've come across an activist and campaigning group working on the arms trade quite as effective over so many, many years as CAT. And I think while in the United Kingdom, we often need to hang our heads in shame at the nature of our arms trade and the impact it has on the world, we should also take great pride in the reality that we have one of the outstanding activist groups working against the arms trade. So Kirsten, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here tonight, as it is the Reverend Dan Woodhouse, known to many of us and many of you as Woody. Dan is a Methodist minister and an anti-arms trade activist who I'm sure many of you will recall when he, with a fellow activist, Sam Warton, actually broke in to the self-same Warton that is featured in the film. And we're going to ask Woody to tell us a bit more about that in the context of the film. I'd like to start, if I may, by asking each of the panelists, perhaps starting with Matt and Phil, who were directly involved in the production of this short film. I'm going to ask each of you either about the process of making the film, your views having now made the film in the case of Matt and Phil, and for Kirsten and Woody, your reflections on the film and on Warton's War on Yemen. Matt, could you kick us off?
Sure. I should say firstly that the film is directed by Phil and produced, and he is the brains behind it. But I guess the major takeaway I had from the experience of going up to Warton and filming there, but also in London, was the fact that this war that is a British war and has been going on since 2015 has created the world's worst humanitarian disaster is a dirty little secret to this country. Most people don't know. Warton is a key piece or a key player in the Saudi war machine, and yet most of the people we talked to there didn't have any idea about what was happening inside the factory and its relationship with Saudi Arabia and relationship with Yemen. So I think that what it really pressed home to me is that there's a degree of education that needs to happen and awareness building in this country about the war in Yemen, not only the war in Yemen, but the British role. And it's multifaceted and huge and deep, the British role. As you would have seen in the film, people who used to work for BAE say that they think that the Saudi Air Force would be grounded within a couple of weeks if the maintenance and servicing that BAE provides in tandem with the UK government wasn't provided. So this war basically couldn't go on without UK support. And I think that the reason that it's so, the awareness levels are so low is because the government knows, BAE System knows, if there was wide awareness of what was happening and our role in it, it would stop because people are outraged. As you might have seen in the final bit, we went to Preston to talk to people about their opinions on the war and Warton's role. And most of them, when presented with the information about this weekly flight, its role in servicing Typhoon fighter jets, which are bombing Yemen, they were outraged. But hardly anyone knew. So they want to keep it secret. They want to keep it discreet. And what we need to do as journalists, activists, and anyone else who cares about the fact that millions of children are on the brink of starvation in Yemen is raise awareness, because this dirty little secret, when it's exposed, to sunlight, there's a chance it can stop.
Thanks, Matt. Phil, first of all, thank you to both of you for creating this film. As Matt says, it's incredibly important in the context of what our role is and how little most Britons know about it. The extraordinary former war reporter, Chris Hedges, in the US, has said repeatedly that if we had on our screens every night the death, destruction, and immiseration that our countries cause around the world, our citizens would be far less likely to allow this to continue to happen in our names and, after all, using our tax pounds. Phil, your thoughts having made the film?
Yeah, I think that was partly our motivation for making the film, was to show the suffering in Yemen and how it's connected to this village in Lancashire, this extraordinary village which has its own airport and arms factory, and this weekly cargo flight that we saw on a flight radar website going to Saudi Arabia each week, and we realised that this was how they were resupplying the Saudi Air Force. So we thought, we had to go up there and see it for ourselves and talk to local people there about their attitude, their awareness of it, and their feelings about it. And also we were lucky enough to speak to Molly Mulready, this effectively a whistleblower at the Foreign Office, who has come out very strongly against the arms exports to Saudi Arabia. But what she's said has almost been ignored by the rest of the media. So we were really keen to interview her as well. And it's great to see so many people tonight from all different parts of the UK and around the world. There are lots of towns in the UK who have similar stories, arms factories and things like this, connections to conflicts around the world. I did a film last year down in Newquay where there was a helicopter training academy that the Nigerian military were using. So we are keen to try and shine a light on these different parts of the UK and its connection to the global arms trade. And we did this film on a really low budget, and apologies for any technical issues with the film, but we just wanted to get out there and just get what we could and just sort of show how, we can, Declassified is a small and new media organization, but we can make investigative films like this, and we're keen to do more of them, and just see how much interest there is in this kind of journalism, which I feel the broadcasters used to do, but increasingly do a lot less of these kind of investigative reports. So that's kind of what we were going for, and I hope people get a good taste of that. The film's just 25 minutes long, so don't worry if you haven't watched it yet. It's on YouTube. You can watch it whenever you like. And something we didn't actually cover in the film is what Woody and Sam Walton did, which I'm sure he'll explain sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Phil. And I think crucially, for those of you who want to see more real investigative media about the role that the United Kingdom and other countries play in the world, please do support independent media like Declassified UK and others. They are absolutely crucial at filling the massive gap that is left by the mainstream media in covering these sorts of things today. Let's perhaps go straight from you, Phil, to Woody then, before I come to Kirsten. Woody, you obviously have history with the base.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could just tell us briefly a little bit about that, and therefore what it was like for you to have a look at this film, given your history with the base.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for just pausing 5 minutes at half past. It gave me a chance just to finish it off in my disorganized day. Yeah, it was like watching a dream, or you might say nightmare, with the film, in the sense that the kind of filming around Warton was very familiar, and the facts and figures and the things that were going on, though some of the things were different that were put across in the film to what I knew and have known. It was all very similar theme to what brought Sam and I to breaking into the base. So the film's excellent and really summarizes very well where we've been and where we are and where we can continue to be. And so, yeah, for Sam and I, it was, we could see that the government, I mean, very naively almost, when I saw this war starting, and I knew all the interactions between Saudi and the UK, I kind of thought, well, it's so obvious that this is illegal. I can't see this going on much longer. This was, 4 years ago. And then months went by, and it was clear the UK government just did not care. We're not interested, and no, even legal rulings or legal advice wasn't making a dent. And so that's when we're like, well, somebody's got to, kind of go in there and stop it. It was Sam who caught me at a Quaker wedding and asked me whether I wanted to do it, and it went from there. And so, yeah, I mean, the experience of going in with this information is, I always kind of knew we were going to be found not guilty, and then we're found not guilty we didn't quite get to the Jets, but we were put on trial for breaking in. And the funny thing is, I was so optimistic about being found not guilty because the evidence is so overwhelming that this is illegal, and it's so depressing that is the case, and that 4 years later nothing's really changed. And so it's yeah, in that sense it's kind of miserable to watch the film as well, kind of having done something so extreme, and for all the efforts of everybody else, which were far more than Sam and I, and it still goes on, is depressing. But I'm hugely thankful for these kind of films, because, yeah, as you say, the mainstream media doesn't care. I don't see anything from it. So, yeah.
Thanks, Woody. And I think it's fair to say that when you and Sam did what you did, and especially when you were found not guilty for effectively having committed a minor crime in order to prevent a far greater and more deadly crime, I think that gave an enormous amount of hope, not only to many of us here, but of course there were many in Yemen itself who responded incredibly positively to the solidarity that you had shown. And I think at the forefront of all of our minds as we watch the film, as we think about these issues, has to be innocent civilians on the ground in Yemen. Because for me, having worked on the arms trade for a couple of decades now, to see a conflict in which civilians are intentionally targeted in the way that they have been in Yemen is truly terrifying. And the fact that it makes absolutely no difference to our government, to other governments, to international organizations. And amongst the people responding to this quite desperate situation, primarily desperate on the ground in Yemen, but also desperate in the corridors of power in the United Kingdom, in the United States, have been organizations like the Campaign Against Arms Trade. Kirsten, can you give us some thoughts on the film and on the work that CAT is doing around the conflict in Yemen and factories like Warton's role in it?
Yeah, well, and I first to say thank you for inviting me on, and thank you to Phil and to Matt for a great film. I mean, the first thing to say about it is I think it really makes the whole situation real. You know, it shows that Warton's not just a fictional place where, you know, we hear about bad things happening. It's a real place. There are real flights with real weapons on real planes flying out to be used in a real war. And what I like about the film is you can see that it's there right in front of you. The second thing to say about it is that there are real people affected by it. And you know, I was reminded. There were obviously clips of people who'd been hurt in the war in Yemen. And several years ago, I was on the media desk when Saudi planes bombed a school bus in a marketplace in Yemen. And again, the sort of early images that came out weren't the sanitized images that you later saw on BBC and ITV. They were people taking pictures of what they were looking at. And it's really interesting that when the press later arrived in that market town, the cameras were pointing everywhere apart from where the bomb hit and what was left there. And I think it's really important that we understand that you know, those real bombs and those real shipments then affect real people. And not just the people targeted by the weapons. I mean, we heard obviously from the neighbours of the place who were effectively being silenced. They don't really know what's going on, and if they do, they can't talk about it because they either work there or their business relies on that. Or you've got people like Molly, who I do remember from the court case. I remember seeing her in the case, and Andrew, who was working media at the time, pointed her out to me. Another Andrew, you know, where. Again, she knows quite a bit, but she is also being silenced by secrecy laws, professional laws. And I think that's the third thing to say is, you know, it's real places, it's real people, and it's also a real problem. You know, we know this stuff is going on, and yet the silence and the secrecy around it, as you saw, the real security that's kind of protecting this stuff. If you and I wanted to go and stop it, you've got walls and walls of fences, as Woody talked about. And even if you get through that, you then see the kind of blandishment from the government about, you know, oh, you know, they're a long-term ally. We've been friends for years and years. This is just, you know, just part of the friendship. It's just a friendly export of lethal weapons. And so that's one of the reasons why we took them to court. That's one of the reasons why we were very keen at CAT to make sure that the government should be held accountable for these kind of decisions. And as the film made clear, you know, we eventually won on appeal, and we stopped some of the shipments, but not all of them. A lot of the licenses that had previously been granted just stayed in force whilst they were getting their heads together. And then the government decided to single-handedly decided it has met the conditions of the court and start shipping the remaining licenses again. So we took it back to court, and we got permission to have another hearing, and so we're hoping to see them in court sometime next year. But whilst that legal process drags out, real people are being affected. So that's that.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, and thank you so much for the strategic litigation that CAT has and will continue to bring, which I think is so important in this conflict. Just a reminder to you that you can ask questions of the panel in the Q&A section, which is on the far right of your screen at the bottom. We're not going to be able to follow everything that's in the chat, so if you do have a specific question for the panel, please do put it there, and we already have quite a few questions. The first of which, Kirsten, you touched on, which is George says, Molly said that she was frightened at the prospect of divulging certain information. What would she be frightened of, and is this fear reasonable? obviously, the first thing that you hinted at, Kirsten, is the Official Secrets Act. She is bound by the Official Secrets Act. She is bound by various legal codes. But I'm not sure whether there are sort of other fears that she may have. I don't know, Matt, Phil, whether you chatted to her about that at all, whether you have a sense of why she might be fearful, besides obviously the legal restrictions on her.
Well, I mean, yeah, as you said, she's bound by the Official Secrets Act, which she signed when she started working for the Foreign Office. But I mean, we know what the Saudi regime is like. So we didn't specifically talk about that, but I'm sure that's probably something that she worries about as well, because and BAE Systems itself is a very, very powerful institution in this country. It effectively operates as an arm of the British state. There's a whole unit within the Department of International Trade, which is set up to help BAE sell its wares around the world, and other arms companies, but BAE is so far the biggest player that it basically just works for BAE. So and BAE would not take kindly to someone coming out with information which would really put in peril those contracts with the Saudis. So I mean, I think BAE sent a corporate spy into CAT at one point. I'm not sure, in the 90s maybe. So that there's all these. I mean, all these different institutions, they all have an interest in shutting people like Molly Moridi up. So there's those concerns. But I think mainly what she was talking about in that case were fears about breaching the Official Secrets Act and having legal problems. But she was quite candid about the fact that she was going in to meet with Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary and briefing him about civilian casualties and atrocities that were happening in Yemen. And the image she gave of him was that you just thought it was a bit of a joke. He would laugh about it and crack jokes in the middle of these meetings. And it really does. When she was telling me that, we all sort of know that Boris Johnson is a bit of a psychopath, with COVID, with I want to see the bodies piling high in the street. But to be that cold-hearted when you're presented with evidence that your ministry is effectively facilitating the slaughter of children is quite chilling, to be honest with you. And I'm sure by the sounds of things, she knows a lot more specifics that would have a legal would lead to legal action. It could lead to legal action being taken against the government. So I'm sure she's probably weighing out whether she wants to divulge that, because obviously some people do know within the state information which could help bring an end to British support for this war. And in fact, it is quite interesting that there's been so few whistleblowers. You're talking about the major humanitarian disaster in the world today, of which our government is complicit and supporting, and yet we have Molly Moridi, but there's British personnel inside the Air Operations Center of Saudi Arabia who have access to information about all their airstrikes in Yemen. Now, why haven't one of them had a crisis of conscience? As someone mentioned, the bus, the children's bus that was blown up, I think in 2018, 40 children blown up. You would have thought someone who was in the Air Operations Center, who saw that, who knows the specifics of that, and would have blown the whistle. Molly did mention that, not in a specific way, but she said that the lack of compassion for the Saudis was astounding. By the Saudis was astounding, and you see that with the bombing campaign. They just do not care about civilian casualties and actively seek it in some cases. As she mentioned, there was a funeral in Sana'a which was advertised on Facebook, which was full of civilians, and they bombed that. So I think Molly Moridi was scared of the legal implications, and I think that's probably why more people haven't come forward. But hopefully, as time goes on, they will go forward. And the other thing is that this is not made an issue by the media. I think the media was out there covering this properly. More people will come out of the woodwork and feed information to journalists, because the government's on the ropes on this issue. Everyone is one of those issues that everyone who knows, who is told the evidence, finds out, is outraged. So the more information we have, the more pressure that is built on the government, and the closer we can get to stopping it.
Absolutely. I think what is extraordinary is, as you say, and I felt this watching the film, why are there not more Molly Mulreadys coming out from within government who have a great deal of knowledge about what the government is doing, who are in some instances, as Molly identifies herself, complicit in defending or in some way enabling what the government is doing, and expressing great respect for what Molly has done. There are two things that concern me. One is obviously that there are others in government who need to be looking at themselves. And I think this is throughout government in this country. I think it's throughout many of the governments who are arming conflicts in Yemen and other parts of the world. But the second side of it is, in an effectively functioning democracy, when you have a whistleblower like Molly Mulready, that would be all over the evening news for months and months and months until the government was forced to resign. But has she appeared on the BBC? Has she appeared on any of the big commercial news organizations? Of course she hasn't. She struggles even to get her voice heard. And I think that this is a reflection of just how morally corrupted our society has become, because we supposedly make huge amounts of money from these arms deals. There is another dimension that is not unrelated to this. David says, is there some way we can find of encouraging workers and trade unions to refuse to be a part of this murderous scandal? And he compares it with the story of the Rolls-Royce workers in Scotland who refused to service engines for planes that were being used by the Chilean Air Force in the coup that brought Pinochet to power, and obviously to keep him in power after that. And somebody else in the chat has just mentioned the fact that Unite's Assistant General Secretary, Steve Turner, has spoken about the fact that they have workers at Warton and they want to do everything that they can to defend their jobs. But that, this raises a whole lot of questions, both about the economics of the arms trade, because I think, Kirsten, you might agree that there is a significant amount of work that suggests that the defense sector is a very economically, not obviously socially, but economically inefficient way of creating jobs, of growing an economy. So there's that dimension that you might want to comment on. And there is the issue that others on the panel might want to also comment on about how one brings the unions into this coalition, trying to stop the devastating impact of the British arms trade around the world. Kirsten?
Yeah, and I think we need to remember about arms sales and about arms manufacture. The domestic market is really, as they would call it, the domestic market, the market for in the US and the UK for weapons is clearly the big bread and butter part of BAE Systems' bank balance, and that is all publicly funded. That's money that the government has decided it's going to give BAE Systems to do. It's going to spend the money on war. And when you look at the balance of resources between, for example, buying aircraft and then, or for example, preparing for climate change, we've got COP26 coming up. The former dwarfs the latter. By a factor of 10 in terms of expenditure. So when the chap from Unite says, "Well, what about my members' jobs?" The issue that we have is the game is rigged. If you've got 10 times as much public money going into one area and 10% of it going into another area, of course, people are going to say, well, that's how I'm going to work. So, but we need to understand that the government is making these democratic choices supposedly on our behalf. And so if we had, as you say, a functioning democracy, we could actually put pressure on the government to make different and better choices. I think the other thing to say, and this is something I know is close to Andrew's heart, is that a lot of I've seen many arms trades across the world. It's very rare that some degree of corruption isn't involved. In fact, I would argue that almost every major arms deal has massive amounts of corruption involved. And so where we're dealing with countries like Saudi Arabia, where we're dealing with countries like ourselves, there is quite a big payday for the people buying the weapons, or their families, or their contacts, or their their wider social network. And so, you know, we as a country need to be much more on it in terms of dealing with international corruption and money laundering. And that's also another big part of how it is. Because if there was no money, I guarantee you there wouldn't be any arms shipments. Oh, sorry, Andrew, you're muted.
I mean, even the industrialist Henry Ford, whose politics I don't think many of us would have shared when he was alive, said, if you want to stop war, look who makes money from the war. And unfortunately, that's an incredibly important part of it. The arms trade accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all world trade, and absolutely crucially, plays a very important role in funding politicians, political parties, former military leaders, the so-called global national security elite. So I think that's very important. In terms of the union question, any thoughts from the panel as to how we address that?
I can talk specifically about Warton on this because I did approach Unite to get some information about what their operations inside Warton, and they gave me the emails of a couple of union members inside because I wanted to interview them. And I did actually, there was some back and forth. This was actually a couple of years ago. There was some back and forth and they said, yeah, you can come up and interview us. And then they said just before I was about to go up that they had to get the okay from the company. And after that, I never heard back. So it's a difficult one because, as you say, the unions, which you would expect to be on your side on issues like this, they obviously their main responsibility is to their members, and their members are inside these factories working, so they have to defend them, I guess. But the whole discourse is generated by the state and the arms industry as well. They put all this propaganda out, which is about it's vital to the British economy, it's vital for jobs, it's vital for the community. What they don't tell you is that it's massively inefficient. That if the government put that money into things like renewable energy or other sectors that actually had some social use, they could actually get more workers and get more societal benefits out of it. But just to finish with, I also went to Barrow in Furness a couple of years ago, which the whole town is basically built around the BAE shipyard where they're building the successor submarines to carry Trident. So it's a huge operation. And I did talk to a lot of workers in the pubs about arms conversion, because this was when Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, and I was asking about their feelings about him. It was quite interesting because a lot of them said, we're not against working in a different sector, using our skills for different things. But they, more than one of them pointed to the fact that when they closed down the mines in the 80s, and Thatcher closed down the mines and said, we'll replace these mining jobs with other jobs. And they never did. And those mining communities are still, lots of them are still on benefits. The lucky few are working in sort of call centers. But there was never that, the promises that were made by the Thatcher government to replace these jobs were never made, were never kept. So a lot of the people in Barrow and Furness were saying, look, we don't mind Corbyn and we like the idea of doing something else. But the point is, we can't trust that they'll do it. So in a very real sense, we have a job now. If we put it at risk, then we might be out of a job, and the promises might not be kept. So I think it's a difficult one because the discourse, as I say, is generated by very powerful, very rich interests, and to try and get the word out that what they're saying is basically propaganda and actually not true is hard to do. But I think it's just about education, because the more people learn, the more they understand we don't have to base our economy around war. And in fact, an interesting facet of the Thatcher revolution in the 80s that's not often talked about is she's seen as destroying industry, right? That's her legacy. She did the Big Bang in the City and replaced industry with finance. But actually, there was one sector which she backed massively, and that was manufacturing arms. She supported BAE hugely. A lot of her foreign trips, the top priority was to help BAE sell weapons. So she very much focused, and we live with that legacy now, where there's a whole private industry that's being built around GCHQ in Cheltenham, a cyber industry. And this government basically sees our USP, our comparative advantage as war industries. That's what they want to build our whole economy around, and we have to go on a different route because it's so problematic in so many ways. We don't want to be complicit in crimes like Yemen. We don't want to have all our children being exposed to these arms companies and these institutions early in life, which is also happening. We've done a couple of stories on that in Declassified. We've got the legacy of Thatcherism is we've got an extremely militarized society, and we need to change that and go on a different path.
Related to this, we have a comment from David Carter, who says that we need to understand the extent of Lancashire's involvement in the arms and aerospace industries, that whole swathes of the country around Preston, Warton, Preston, Blackpool, Samlesbury, a huge area. And then there are other questions asking, how do we get this sort of information, the sort of stuff that Declassified is putting out? How do we get this to what is described in one of the questions as a grassroots audience in the UK? I don't know, Woody, whether you have any thoughts on that, how we start making people more aware of this reality that they're not going to see on their TV screens or in their newspapers.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information out there. There's some very clever people who got lots of information for Sam and I, which was as we were making up our minds as to what we were going to do. As Sam and I were being quite secretive and putting the information. So it is all out there, getting out. I was actually chatting to a very good friend of mine today, and we were distraught. We were talking about the things that are screwing up this country, and I think we came down to the voting system was in the first past the post, the media and education in schools. This week I was invited to actually talk in a school in Leeds via Zoom, and I was stunned, absolutely amazed that they invited me to talk about my story. It's to do with peace studies and so on in the school, and this is secondary school. I was amazed. That doesn't happen very often. But the encouraging thing we said is actually now, because the media is so widespread in the sense of YouTube and being able to make films on good films on quite low budgets, as we've seen today, we don't just have to rely on the mainstream media. So films like this really kind of bite-sized in its way, 25 minutes, and so to share these kind of films with people, just to get an idea of what's going on. And as has been said quite a few times already, as soon as it becomes a voting issue, it starts to change and disappear. And it kind of, when Jeremy Corbyn was around in the Labour Party, he kind of almost felt like it was close to being a voting issue and never quite made it there. But I think it's possible, and I hope with films like this and with the fact we can share media between ourselves so rapidly and readily, even using Facebook and that kind of thing, I hope is a way. And it's about education, I think for me. How to actually go about doing that, I don't know. No idea. But that's all I can say.
Any other thoughts from any of the panelists about how we communicate more about this at a more accessible level, so that people, including in areas that are involved in these industries, can be made more aware of them? Kirsten?
Yeah, I think personally, you need to personalize it as much as possible. It's very easy to throw billions of pounds around and talk about sort of big picture stuff. But I think if we're communicating about these kind of issues, we do need to connect it to individuals, and dare I say it, create stories, stories that people kind of are inspired by. So Molly's story is inspiring. We need many more of those. And I think it comes back to creating a culture of, dare I say it, well, both storytelling, but also solidarity. I know it's an unfashionable word, perhaps, but one of the things we're told in our media, and as implied by the media, is that what happens overseas doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter there's a war overseas. What's really important is your job and your livelihood and what's going on down at Tesco. Well, if we continue to believe that, and if we continue to kind of have discussions with each other that reinforce that, then we will continue to see the same results. Whereas what the trade union leader for Unite should be saying is, well, actually, you know what? We are in solidarity with the victims of war and oppression around the world. And yes, some of our members work in this industry, but actually this union stands against that stuff. And so we are going to put pressure on the employer to do new things with its technology and with its and with its financial power. That's what I think it is. So personalize it, and start to rebuild solidarity. I think that for me is how we do.
Phil, the role of film. How do we get this film seen as widely as possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's great. We've had nearly 500 people register for this Q&A tonight, which was exceeded our expectations. That's great. And I think the trailer was viewed about 40,000 times on Twitter. So, at Declassified, we are trying to build our own media organization and reach as many people as possible. And that will take time, but, we're definitely moving in the right direction. And hopefully, yeah, films like this of this length will make it more accessible. And we're particularly keen for the film to be seen in Lancashire, in places like Preston. So we can try and advertise it there, and if there are any film screening events in Lancashire that we can show it at, that would be great. But yeah, I mean, it's people can just share it on their networks, WhatsApp, Facebook groups, all that kind of stuff. And just try and blast it out there, because yeah, I mean, the larger media outlets aren't going to do that for us. So but yeah, it's I think as well, we see sort of a whole range of approaches tonight, from what Woody did with his direct action, what Kirsten's doing at CAT with the litigation, Molly speaking out as a whistleblower, and then this issue of trade unions as well that we've discussed. I mean, yeah, there are lots of different kind of links to this chain and places where people can try and exert some kind of influence. So yeah, it's really good to just be discussing that with all of you tonight.
I should also mention that there are, mainly through CAT, there are many local groups working against the arms trade, working for peace, all over the UK and many other parts of the world. And please feel free to contact Campaign Against Arms Trade online, our own organization, Shadow World Investigations. We have done screenings, we do investigative training with many of these groups around the UK and elsewhere. If you are interested in these issues, please do look for a local group. And if you can't find one, do contact CAT or ourselves and we'll direct you to one. There's the age-old question that has come up again, and I'm going to sort of put it as a two-part question. The one is, well, if we stopped, surely the Americans would just replace all of the equipment that we do. And Molly, to some extent in the film, answers it, but I think it would be good to get a more definitive statement on that, on why closing down Warton, stopping the weekly flights, stopping the use of Hawks to train the Saudi pilots, etc., stopping the ordnance, the bombs and missiles that are flowing there, would have an absolutely devastating impact on the Saudi war machine. And also then there are questions around, what are the Saudis and the UAE actually trying to do in Yemen? What are their objectives? I wonder if any of you can deal with those questions.
Yeah, I think in the US, because the UK and the US are the main suppliers of the Saudi Air Force, right? But actually in the US, we've seen this becoming more of an election issue, with Biden making statements about ending or suspending he said he'd suspend offensive arms sales to Saudi Arabia. I mean, how do you define offensive? We've actually seen them continue to do military exercises with the Saudis, and I don't think they've stepped back nearly as much as people hoped Biden would. But in the US, this has actually become much more of an issue. So it looked like there was a point where it looked like the US would stop and it would just be the UK that carried on. So I don't think we can really, I don't really buy into this argument that, the UK pulling out wouldn't matter because the US would carry on. I think, there's a similar level of concern in the US, if not more. So the UK pulling out would be very significant. But in the film, I mean, we didn't really explain why there is the conflict, and we didn't go much into that. And partly because we wanted to focus on the money that people were making, because I think that's a big driver of why the conflict carries on, because it's just so profitable for people like Sir Roger Carr. And also, if you look at Yemeni history, people have changed sides so many times. The Houthis, their ancestors were the Zaidi movement, who were supported by Saudi Arabia and MI6 back in the 60s, I think, in the North Yemen civil war. So, I mean, I kind of didn't want to get bogged down in that you know, why are people fighting? It was more about look at the suffering and look at the profit that's being made, and our direct role in that. So yeah, and obviously in a 25-minute film, there's only so much you can go into, and I felt it would just be a bit superficial if we tried to explain, you know, the intricacies of the conflict. So yeah.
Sorry,
just
Matt.
I was just going to say on the argument that's made of if we don't do it, someone else will. Aside from the moral implications of that, I mean, even just on a legal basis, the UK is violating its own export licensing regime, which, as Molly says in the film, stipulates that if they can't sell weapons if there's a suspicion that they might be used for violations of international humanitarian law. Now, the Saudis are violating international humanitarian law every week with their airstrikes. So, just on that level, they on a legal level, they should be hauling their arms sales to the Saudis and should have done it a long time ago. On the second, on the argument that someone else would do it, it's also just not true on a practical level, because as Molly also mentions, we've been selling this kit to the Saudis for decades now, and a lot of these planes and other military equipment need servicing from the British that they couldn't just get from the Chinese or the Russians. They can't just put Russian kit in a British in a Typhoon jet. So it's just not true. If we pulled out and stopped support for the Saudis, there would be a perceptible impact very quickly. And the fact we're not doing it has huge moral implications, because as has been mentioned many times, it's the world's worst humanitarian disaster. So it should be front and center of the media, which you mentioned, Andrew, and that is a huge point, is that alternative media, I think, plays an important role in how we get the message out, because these companies and the culprits of the Yemen conflict, but also a lot of suffering around the world in other places, are infested in our media, infested in our universities, they're infested in the schools, they're everywhere. I was looking the other day, the New Statesman, which is on the surface a left liberal magazine, runs BAE advertorials, which actually written, it says by BAE Systems for their bylines. They get paid by BAE Systems to run stuff that whitewashes their role in Yemen. It talks about how all the great stuff they do for young students. So when you've got the sort of left end of the spectrum of the mainstream thinking that's acceptable to do, you kind of understand how deep the problem is. And what we have to do is problematize that and isolate and target institutions that are willing to whitewash BAE's crimes, and then build an alternative which makes very clear that they will not have anything to do with arms companies and other parts of the war machine. And as I mentioned initially, I think the whole way these crimes can continue is there is a conspiracy of silence, and that most people don't know, and that's how they get away with it. So we need to just constantly raise awareness, which is why activism is so important. What those guys did in Warton and breaking in and actually people reading in the paper, oh, why are these people on trial? Why did they do that? Raising that awareness, but also journalistically, and also telling parents, because one of the stories that we did, I think it was last year, was about GCHQ, which is the UK's largest intelligence agency, running this program in schools, including in primary schools in Gloucestershire, where it's based, where they were facilitating the entry of BAE Systems, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and other arms companies into these schools in the area, and setting up. This is not even a joke. They set up speed dating sessions between students, like primary school students, and these arms companies, where these arms companies would sit down and these young kids would go around and meet all these different companies. And the parents don't mind, because they don't know what these companies are involved in. They don't know that Raytheon are producing missiles which have blown up 40 kids on a bus in Yemen. So what we need to do is problematize these institutions and make people aware that they are complicit and facilitating and supporting some of the worst crimes in the world, including the murder of children. And I think that as alternative media grows, that will happen. As Phil's film and Declassified's film, I think is an example of how I think we're on a good trajectory. As has been also put in the chat box, Ricky at Real Media has done some great work on this as well. So I think the onus is on us to create alternatives to try and raise awareness.
I'd like to just move the conversation not to an entirely different topic, but to a couple of other questions that have been asked around the environmental consequences of what is going on in Yemen, about the environmental consequences of the arms trade generally. Martha gives some information in the Q&A about some concerns that have been identified, that have all been placed at the door of the Houthis, as though the Saudi and UAE-led coalition is completely blameless. And a number of others have asked about the sorts of impact that this sort of conflict has on the environment. And I think, Kirsten, it might have been you who said very early on, we're investing all of this money in war making, effectively. It's not an economically efficient form of investment. 3 studies in the US across the 3 estimated that given the amount of public investment in every job in the defense sector, we could create between 3 and 7 jobs in more socially and economically productive sectors, particularly renewable energy. So Kirsten, Woody, do you have any thoughts on the sort of environmental consequences of this sort of conflict, and how, if we're going to take the climate crisis seriously, we have to look at conflict in the arms trade?
Yeah, Woody can say some words, but I should say I was outside BAE Systems down in Farnborough a couple of weeks ago, and their head office there is on an aerodrome with a ton of private aircraft flying backwards and forwards. Literally a private plane taking off every 15-20 minutes. Huge noise. Maybe flying 1 or 2 people to wherever it is they need to go. So we're dealing with an industry that is, should we say, opaque to concerns regarding the climate. And I think it's a twofold problem. One problem, as we talked about, is that diversion of resources from essentially climate to warfare, which is what we've got going on. And the other thing to say is, as many people noted, one of those planes, it literally takes 10 gallons a second of fuel to keep it up in the air, along those lines. So it is that kind of thing of these things are hugely wasteful activities, both in terms of the fuel required to fly the aircraft and to drive the tanks or whatever, and also the fuel required to make them. And so if people get a chance, I would recommend a report by Scientists for Global Responsibility, who talk about something called the global boot print, which actually describes some of the environmental impact of both warfare as it is, the military making the equipment, the fueling of the military, and also the impact of making different choices over climate over warfare. But I'm sure Woody's got something to say as well.
Yeah, thanks. The thing that I've thought a couple of times as we've been going through actually on the, and it kind of relates slightly to the unions question as well. Throughout COVID, one of the very few positive things that I noticed as all this was going on was how quickly factories could retool. So there was a cry out for ventilators, and I think it was a Formula One team, at least one Formula One team, I think, retooled to do ventilators. And I was like, well, if a Formula One team can retool to do ventilators, then surely BAE Systems could retool to make wind turbines, or whatever it may be, all the different things that could bring about a green future. And Boris Johnson himself, as well as lots of other UK politicians, always bang on about how we're world leaders in green energy. I'm not sure how true that is. I'm sure in some ways it might be, but we really could be so rapidly, miles ahead of everyone else if we retooled. And from the stuff that happened during COVID, the retooling, it shows that actually it's pretty easy by the looks of it. I'm not an expert on retooling, so we could go from weapons to green technology really rapidly, as far as I can see, and save jobs. I'm sure it's not that simplistic, but I bet it's not far away.
Obviously, these issues are going to be front and center at COP26, and particularly at the sort of civil society action that's going to be taking place in parallel to COP26. And I think it's a very important time for all of us to think of the link between climate and conflict. And when we think of the reasons for maintaining our extremely high defense budgets, when we look at the other crises that we're facing, I mean, the absurdity of a situation that our government in the UK increased the defense budget by £17 billion in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, when our frontline healthcare workers didn't have sufficient masks and gloves to go about their work. I mean, this complete absurdity of the allocation of resources is driven again, I think, by what we were talking about earlier, the sort of media frenzy that is created around the fear there is and that we should have. And a number of people have asked, and maybe I'm going to ask you all for your final comments here, but think about this, because a number of people have asked us, why is the UK so invested in helping the Saudis and the UAE and Yemen? What are we trying to do in the region? What are we trying to do geopolitically? What are the Saudis and the Emiratis trying to do there? So we're going to go through the panel one more time very briefly in the small amount of time we have left. So feel free to respond to those sorts of questions, but also anything else that you want to say in conclusion. Matt, shall we start with you?
Why is the UK supporting the Saudis? Well, it's not for the benefit of our security, and it's not for the benefit of 99% of the British people. It's because it serves very well certain interest groups. And those interest groups are BAE Systems and the political elites that benefit financially when there's a massive revolving door between government and the arms companies, and the royal family. I mean, it's integral. The Saudi relationship is integral to the British establishment, and it goes for the other Gulf regimes as well, like Oman and the UAE. But it's very important to get that point across, because the way that when they are asked about the Saudi relationship, so there's things flare up, because obviously it's an embarrassing relationship in a way, because we know what the Saudi regime is about, and then they murder a Washington Post columnist in an embassy, and people are asking the Brits about the British government about it. And when they're asked about it, they say it's to do with they can have more influence. We can have more influence if we're friends with them. We can stop them doing these things, and it helps British security. It's all rubbish. So it's all propaganda, and it's about as Steve, our friend in Freckleton, which is the town on the side of the aerodrome, said to us when we asked about it, said it all comes down to pounds, shillings, and pence, and that's the fact. People make a lot of money out of that relationship, and they want it to continue, and that's why the war in Yemen is continuing, and the British role is continuing, because BAE is making billions of pounds from it. So we need to. That point needs to be hammered home, because it's totally at odds with what we're told. And just to finish, and the conclusion after making the film is just that the war in Yemen really exposes so much about the corruption of British society on so many different levels, from the corruption of BAE Systems, from the corruption of our political system, from the corruption of our media. The fact that this government is getting away with what it's getting away with, and the fact that BAE Systems is getting away with what it's getting away with, exposes completely our media system. It should be that they should be, as Andrew said, covering this day in, day out. Ministers should be getting absolutely hammered on this topic, but yet it's barely mentioned ever. And an interesting case actually was the Tory leadership election, which Boris Johnson won. And they had two former foreign ministers in that leadership race. So it was Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson, who had both overseen the exports to Saudi Arabia while it was committing war crimes in Yemen. Neither of them were asked once about the war in Yemen. It was not an issue, not an issue. Now, what kind of media system, what kind of political system operates where two ministers that have been party to one of the worst crimes in the world, just aren't asked about. It's completely airbrushed from it. And I think that just goes to the heart of the problem we have in this society, is that we've just got a completely corrupted political system, which is aided by the fact we have a completely corrupted media system. So we need to go to a root and branch approach and just build alternatives, because as I mentioned earlier, we live with the legacy of Thatcherism, where the whole British economy was reformulated to be based around finance and war. And we've still got that. And we need to have a new development model. And the start of that is to raise awareness, and the start of that is to make it clear to people that it doesn't benefit your average Joe in Britain to have this massive war industry. It doesn't benefit your average Joe to have this inflated city of London. We can have ways where we're not destroying the planet, and people can have jobs at the same time. It is possible. So I think that the war in Yemen, in an approximate sense, is a disaster we need to stop, but it also just exposes many longer term problems we have within our society.
Thanks very much, Matt. Can I suggest that we ask Woody and Kirsten for any final thoughts, and then come to Phil to give the director the last word? And Woody, you're going to have to answer the question very briefly in this: what sort of sentence you might have got if you had been found guilty?
So if they'd gone all out and charged us with a conspiracy to commit almost £1 billion worth of damage, which they had the evidence to put us on trial for, yeah, I don't know, 10 years in prison plus. It was under £5,000 criminal damage, so it would have been a fine, I think, or maybe a short term in prison, which we got away with. That's very briefly on the previous question. Money and having a jolly good time, I think, is why they do it. The slush fund, I think, is that the right word, says a lot of things about BAE systems under the arms companies.
Kirsten?
Well, I think it is a legacy of and the continuation of empire. You know, we are looking at the idea that this goes back to Thatcherism is accurate, but we need to understand where that came from. You know, this country has decades of experience of waging wars around the world, arming its allies, using force to obtain resources, and using those resources to generate funds for the city in this kind of continuing cycle of abuse and death. And everybody seems to benefit. The people in the country seem to benefit. The war, people making the war seem to benefit. The armies, the navies, the air force, the arms trade. It's almost as if there are no victims. And yet, in fact, as we've seen, there are millions of victims, tens of thousands of victims in Yemen, and millions are starving there. So in the end, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the legacy of and the continuation of empire and colonialism. And we need to start to change the way that we think of the world, and change our ideas about who we are as a nation. Because if this is who we are, we don't deserve to survive.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I think this relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf regimes goes really deep to the heart of what Britain is as a nation. You know, there was that period after World War II where the formal empire was breaking up, and one way that the UK found it could keep its influence in the world was by cementing these relationships with the Gulf regimes and arming those leaders to stay in power in the face of popular movements to unseat them, and that's continued ever since. And you know, when I speak to people from Saudi and the Emirates, I mean, it's not a perfect focus group, but you know, they're horrified at the war and what's being done to Yemen, but you know, there's no democracy in Saudi or the Emirates, and if you speak out, you can pay an incredibly high price. And some of the Saudi, you know, clerics who've spoken out have been imprisoned for criticizing the war, and might face the death penalty. So, you know, as difficult as it is in the UK, at least we're not operating under those conditions, and we do have, you know, independent media where we can make these kind of things and try and educate ourselves and our communities about what's going on. So I hope the film can play a small part in that. And particularly at this time, someone's just mentioned the Newcastle United takeover, where, yeah, in the north of England, there's probably going to be increased interest in what Saudi Arabia is about and its links to this country.
It's a very good point. Thank you very much, Phil. And Phil and Matt, thank you so much for this film. Thank you so much for your work, and keep it coming. It's desperately needed. Woody, Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us and for the work that you both do in your different spheres. As has been said repeatedly, there are things you can do. You can do them locally. They can be low profile. You can get involved in investigating things behind the scenes, get involved in campaigning with one of your local anti-arms trades groups. You can even get involved in direct action, like we're seeing undertaken by Palestine Action Against Elbit, the Israeli drone maker. The most important thing, though, is that you try and inform as many people as you possibly can about the reality of what is going on in your names and using all of our tax pounds. And the work of CAT, the work that Woody does, the work of Declassified UK, and many thanks to Vicky Thomas, who's been running things behind the scenes for us tonight from Declassified. This sort of work is really important to spread as broadly and widely as possible throughout the UK and the world. So if you take one thing away from this evening, in thanking you for your interest and thanking you for being with us tonight, for your great questions and comments in the chat, try and get as many friends and family as you possibly can just to watch this 25-minute film, and let that start a conversation about the UK and the world's arms trade. Because if we don't make changes to the way in which arms are produced and exported around the world, what is happening in Yemen today is going to continue happening for many years to come, and is going to continue happening in many other places around the world as well. So thank you very much. And from Declassified UK, good night.